Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending this session. My name is Karim Haggag. I am the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI for short. And it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our session this morning titled Arms Control, the Nuclear Challenge of Our Era. So as is evident from the title, this session focuses very much on the current dynamics related to nuclear issues in today's international landscape. So thank you for the Doha Forum for organizing the session and including this topic on the agenda. So the point of departure for this discussion is that we are living in a different moment. It is a dangerous moment. We live in a situation of heightened nuclear risk. The arms control process that structured nuclear competition over the course of the last few decades is over. We are witnessing a trend towards revitalized national debates. So there are discussions in several key international capitals reassessing their nuclear posture, considerations of obtaining a military nuclear capability. We are seeing indications of a renewed nuclear arms race that is gearing up. We have different players now on the nuclear scene. The nuclear competition that used to be confined between the United States and Russia, to that we now must add China as a newcomer in the global nuclear arms race. We are witnessing very interesting developments in the realm of emerging technologies. So artificial intelligence, space, cyberspace, quantum computing, additive manufacturing, all of these have implications in the nuclear realm and how these technologies intersect with the old technologies of weapons of mass destruction, and in particular nuclear weapons, is one of the key issues related to this moment of heightened nuclear dangers. Against this backdrop, the purpose of this panel is to address several key questions. How is it possible to renew the momentum towards arms control? How can we find pathways back to instilling confidence to mitigate the risks of these renewed nuclear dangers? But most important of all, to dive into what the current moment looks like, what is the trajectory of the nuclear dangers that we face, and how can we best address these different challenges. So to address these questions, we have assembled what I think is a stellar panel that is with us today that brings deep expertise on these issues. Allow me to introduce our speakers. So we are very fortunate to have Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. Izumi, thank you very much for joining us. We have Dr. Francesca Giovannini, the Executive Director for the Project on Managing the Atom at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Francesca, thank you for taking the time to join us. Dr. Togzhan Kassenova, the Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany. Thank you, Togzhan, for joining our panel. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Hassan Elbahtimy, Senior Lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Hassan, as always, thank you for joining this discussion. So Hassan, perhaps I could start with you. If you can set the scene for us and walk us through the dynamics of this current moment. How did we get here at this moment of heightened nuclear risk? What does the current landscape look like? What are the drivers of today's nuclear dangers? And maybe most importantly, where is all of this going? What in your assessment, is the trajectory for these dynamics moving forward?
Great. Thank you so much, Karim, and the Doha Forum and SIPRI as well for organizing this panel. It is such an important and consequential topic, and it's really great to see it represented on the program here in Doha. We are very used to talking about arms control, nuclear weapons in big capitals, DC, New York, London, Paris, and to have that conversation in Doha, I think, is something that should be encouraged because there's so much at stake. And the nuclear question touches everyone. I think you asked me to set the scene, but I think you've done that very, very well, Karim. We are really at an unprecedented moment, and sometimes we can exaggerate how unprecedented it is, but I think it is maybe since the early 70s we've not been in this terrain before. The bilateral arms control process between the US and at that time the Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War, and then after the end of the Cold War, Russia, that has been with us for quite some long time. That bilateral process has unraveled bit by bit, and we're now at a stage where there is actually no functional machinery, treaties, agreements between the two powers that has the vast majority of nuclear arsenals around the world. So there are 9 nuclear weapon states, well, nuclear possessors, let me emphasize. But the US and Russia has the vast majority of arsenals. And since the 1970s, we've had a process where they can talk to one another, agree measures through which they can bring down arsenals, enhance, increase predictability of their nuclear policies. And we've seen bit by bit the unraveling of that infrastructure, which puts us in a position where quite unprecedented, really, and very high stakes for the whole world. But it's not just that. We're also seeing a lot of discontent and fragmentation in the global nuclear order more broadly. So at the top, if you may, that breakdown, but at the bottom there is also a lot of frustration that the institutions that are multilateral in nature perhaps came out of the post-war, and by war here I mean World War II, that really was housed within the UN and its machinery to address the nuclear question, as also now seeing a lot of discontent and fragmentation. To the vast majority of countries that don't have nuclear weapons, bringing down numbers, nuclear numbers, moving towards disarmament is a key priority, and there's been very little on that recently. Instead, we see increasing rhetoric about the importance of nuclear weapons, sometimes careless movement towards brinkmanship. So, and that also has a side effect of making countries that are really invested in that global architecture to manage global nuclear risks more discontent. And I think one of the key manifestations of that is a new treaty. Well, now it's perhaps not right to call it new because it's been there since 2017, a treaty that prohibits entirely nuclear weapons, TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And it's a sign of frustration that countries that at some point signed up to the global nuclear order in good faith to bring down nuclear numbers are seeing that this pathway is blocked and they need to go into take different measures in order to contain and address nuclear risks, including a global prohibition on nuclear weapons. So to sum up, it's contested at the top, it's a lot of discontent at the bottom, and the challenges are unprecedented and really big and significant, specifically given that perhaps along with climate change, nuclear is one of 2 big existential risks that touch everyone. It's not just the great powers, it's everyone will be touched by nuclear war. So that's why it's very important to talk about it and try to think about how to address these challenges.
No, thank you, Hassan. That was a very incisive overview, if somewhat disturbing. Francesca, based on what Hassan presented, from your vantage point in the US, what should we look for in terms of sort of short-term immediate developments? What, in your assessment, are the coming tipping points that can perhaps accelerate the trends and dynamics that Hassan presented, take them in a new direction? What should we watch out for when we sort of scan the horizon looking forward?
Thank you so much, Karim, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for spending some time talking about weapons of mass destruction. And there is an expression in our community that says, if you don't take care of nuclear weapons will take care of you. And the point is, we are all touched by what happens in the strategic community. And whether we are able finally to manage the nuclear risks of today and tomorrow, or whether in fact we fail, we will all be linked by catastrophic consequences. So I take the job very seriously, and let me then just present a little bit the perspective from the United States. And again, I apologize, I've seen some of my wonderful Chinese colleagues here. I'm sure that if you had Chinese experts on the panel, they would present things very differently. But let me just say that the current status of the global nuclear order is, in the United States perspective, a surprise, to say the least, and in fact, almost a shock. Many US policymakers would argue that this is not the world the United States wanted to live in. This was not the world we intended to create, certainly not after 1991, but here we are. We have done everything we could. We have committed to arms control. We have committed to nuclear restraint. We have complied with our obligations. We have moved away from nuclear weapons from 1970s on, and yet many other countries did not. And in fact, after 1991, we end up in a situation with more nuclear weapon states, not less. So for the United States, the trajectory of this nuclear order is not one of predictability, something actually the United States did not want to see. But here we are. So what do we make of the current nuclear order? For me, there is a very important framework that we have to remember, that we have moved very clearly from a bipolar nuclear order that was somehow based on restraint, but at least on guardrails that us in the Soviet Union understood, common shared understanding of what strategic stability meant, into nuclear anarchy, a multipolar world where doctrines keep changing, emerging technologies are integrated in nuclear weapons, command and control, norms don't count anymore, multiple domains in which nuclear competition is now arising. So it's an anarchy, right? But there are three, in my view, three main trends, three tipping points that you talked about, that to me will stay with us for a long time and will have significant consequences. The first one is the qualitative change in China's nuclear weapon program. I know Professor Chumziwi is here. I respect the Chinese nuclear community. I interact with them for a long time now, and I've learned a lot from them. Let me say that the United States is too much bogged down in the discussion about numbers. We don't care whether the Chinese go up 1,000 or 1,500. The argument is the Chinese are fundamentally changing qualitatively the nature of the nuclear weapon program. And they have made very specific investment in delivery system, mobile platforms, ICBMs, plus silos, hypersonics, drones capable of carrying nuclear weapons that we have never seen in the past. So this is no longer a minimum credible, right, minimalistic nuclear weapon program. This is becoming something else. And it's becoming something else where we don't know the direction of travel nor the intention. But with Beijing, that basically says, look, we're still committed to minimum credible deterrence. And the argument the question we ask is, how can you be saying that you had minimum credible commitment at 300 and the same minimum credible commitment at 600, right? When does this change? And let me also say, we understand perfectly opacity and ambiguity. This is part of the deterrence game. But when there is too much uncertainty, Washington then operates with worst case scenario thinking, that we tend to overreact because we have simply no way to know the trajectory of travel. The second major change to me is the reckless, absolute reckless behavior of Russia in pushing the limits of nuclear technology. And there are two examples I want to give you. The first one is the idea of placing nuclear weapons in space. And the second one is developing nuclear power cruise missiles, also familiarly called flying Chernobyl. If you think this is a good idea, I would love to talk to you after. With the idea of nuclearize everything, right? This is how the Russians present this idea of nuclearizing everything they can. And you should expect the reintroduction of many new things that we have seen during the Cold War. Nuclear artillery, for example, nuclear-tipped interceptors. Now, I understand the need of compensate for conventional asymmetry and weaknesses, but there has to be a trade-off between your security and the enormous, catastrophic safety hazards that you are imposing on the international community while you are testing all these exotic weapons. Let alone the fact that if we start weaponizing with nuclear weapons space, this will be really the last frontier. And there is a treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, that still matters something, at least to the majority of countries. The final tipping point to me is that we are sleepwalking into a further and accelerated automation of nuclear command and control. There is a very clear and fast-paced acceleration in the integration of AI-enabled capabilities in the control of early warning systems and nuclear command and control. Now, don't get me wrong, automation has always been part of the equation. We've always automated systems during the Cold War. But it was a fundamentally different automation. The automation was based on radars, and it was ultimately based on the collection of data points that the analyst could actually verify. Today, the AI-enabled capabilities are way more prescriptive and also adapting. And therefore, the data that we somehow have to make decisions on, we can't necessarily screen for. We don't exactly know the quality of the data on which we are actually being given specific policy options. Let me stop here, but just to say we have a lot to work on, and we need way more people to be involved in this.
Thank you, Francesca. A lot to work on, definitely, and a lot to think about. Maybe to anticipate some questions and pushback, you clearly highlighted what is viewed as alarming nuclear behavior from the vantage point of Washington vis-a-vis China and Russia. I am sure there are warning signs seen from these capitals vis-a-vis the US. So perhaps I could leave you with sort of this to think about. How would you address the growing concerns coming from the US side regarding things such as the resumption of nuclear testing, regarding the Golden Dome, so the idea of a comprehensive anti-missile shield for the continental United States that was just reaffirmed in the recent national security document. This would have highly destabilizing consequences for nuclear deterrence moving forward. So these things are also raising quite a number of alarm bells internationally. But maybe, Togzhan, I could come to you, because your research has focused on a very important piece of this puzzle. How the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Kazakhstan have given up their arsenals at the end of the Cold War. Ukraine in particular is a very important part of this history, because it has a peculiar story going back to the end of the Cold War, in which Ukraine decided to give up its nuclear weapons that it inherited from the former Soviet Union in return for security guarantees. And I think we all know how that story ended. So the narrative around the war in Ukraine and how that will affect the narrative regarding nuclear weapons and the extent to which they provide security or detract from security, I think will be a very important part of this conversation moving forward. How do we assess this particular piece of the puzzle? Specifically, how Ukraine will affect the calculus of aspiring nuclear proliferators in the future?
This is such a good question, and I'll start with an argument that we buy too much into the narrative that nuclear weapons bring more security, and we don't pay enough attention to stories that show that countries might decide that they do not need nuclear weapons specifically for security reasons, and I'll unpack this a little bit. So when the Soviet Union dissolved, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. Especially Kazakhstan and Ukraine had very large numbers of Soviet weapons. Their legal status was unclear. So again, there is this false narrative that somehow they were by default Russian. This was not true. According to the post-collapse agreements, any property that was located in each republic at the time of the collapse belonged to the republic. Of course, nuclear weapons are in a category of their own, but the status was unclear, and without the decision of Kazakhstan and Ukraine, their fate couldn't be decided. Of course, there were limitations in terms of access to command and control. Neither Ukraine nor Kazakhstan could launch them, but again, it was up to them what would happen with these weapons. Also, we always talk about the weapons, and we don't talk enough about the fact that there were tons of nuclear material present in these countries, nuclear facilities, and expertise that these countries fully control. So if for some reason, either Kazakhstan or Ukraine would have made a political decision to create an indigenous, latent nuclear capability, they had a very good foundation. They were better off than Iran. And so why did they decide to give up on nuclear weapons? They both faced extreme risks to their sovereignty and statehood, most stemming from the fact that the economy collapsed completely. There was nothing in stores. I was a teenager when the Soviet Union collapsed. I remember that there was literally nothing. And very deep social-political crisis. And so what role would the weapons play in that? They wouldn't help with any of this. Let me just tell you a little bit about Kazakhstan, the country of my birth. So basically complete crisis, and at the same time, rich natural resources underground, which you couldn't develop without access to foreign direct investment, foreign technology. So what do? Do you choose the North Korea path of becoming a pariah state and trying to get into a nuclear club by force while closing yourself from all these opportunities? And the same for Ukraine. Ukraine also was in a similar position with very severe challenges to its survival. And they understood that they need to enter the international community on good terms and do what was important and more wise for them to do at the time. And they didn't do it just for nothing. They really negotiated really hard the security assurances which they received. And so now when we look back and some criticize and say, oh, maybe Ukraine didn't pay enough attention, that the Budapest Memorandum didn't have enough of enforcement mechanism. We need to remember what the situation was in the early 90s, that they truly made the decision that was wisest for them at the time. And the question shouldn't be whether Ukraine made a mistake. It should be, how did we allow Russia to do what it's doing now? So it's a different angle. And I often think about whether the situation would have been different if post-2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, if the international community would have reacted differently, because then acting president of Ukraine, he approached the Obama administration and his EU partners and asked for assistance, and they said, oh, let's not trigger Russia. And we can see that Russia is very good with self-triggering, and we do see the aggression. Now, in terms of what it means to today and whether others will follow, will want to have nuclear weapons. I think at the high level, the damage is just incredible, the damage to the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, because of course the countries look at that and they see with their own eyes that a country with nuclear weapons can invade another country without nuclear weapons and just do it. But I don't think that in the immediate or midterm future, we'll see the number of proliferators rise exponentially. So the number of countries we are watching remains kind of steady. As for Ukraine itself, and I know this is a debate in Ukraine as well, but again, I don't see in the foreseeable future Ukraine making this choice because military nuclear capability comes with such a high economic and political cost, and Ukraine, unfortunately, has more immediate challenges that it's facing. So I just want to kind of, again, to plead to remember that security can come from other components, from better economy, from access to the international community and institutions, and that the question shouldn't be whether Kazakhstan and Ukraine made a mistake, but the focus and the light should be on Russia.
Right. Thank you very much, Togzhan. Izumi, I wanted to keep you at the end of this first round to offer your reflections on what has been said from your vantage point at the UN. So you've heard Hassan talk about the rising discontent with regards to the global nuclear order. Francesca talked about the tipping points at a strategic level in the competition between Washington, China, and Russia. And then, of course, we have Ukraine and the uncertainty that surrounds the war and the post-war security dynamics coming out of that. How are you seeing all of this from the vantage point of New York? And specifically, if I can press you to tell us your reflections on the implications of all of this for the global non-proliferation regime. I mean, all of these factors place tremendous stress on the framework, the multilateral framework that we have. How should we think about all of this? How would you think about all of this?
Well, thank you very much to Doha Forum, and thank you, Karim. Well, I basically agree with everything that's been said. All these phenomenons and global context today really does have a detrimental negative impact on the regime or nuclear weapons order, as someone mentioned. I think everything like rhetoric of potential nuclear weapons use, the rumors about potential resumption of nuclear testing, utilities of nuclear weapons in the security doctrines, all of these things are, on a daily basis, really weakening what we have so far in terms of the regime. The fundamental issue that we really have to acknowledge and reconfirm is the understanding that more nuclear weapons do not make us safer. Quite the contrary, it is actually bringing huge amount of unpredictability and also a danger. It's an existential threat that we all agree to, climate change and nuclear weapons. Now, I think those trends, the three tipping points that Francesca mentioned, we have been actually cautioning. I mean, the UN usually does not want to get into a lot of sensitive security discussions, so we frame it in a little bit milder way. But for example, the exotic weapons that you mentioned, or the missile defense issues that you mentioned, I have been saying that there should be absolutely a restraint on all countries, all nuclear weapon states in particular, about the development and deployment of new weapon systems that have strategic impact, strategic stability impact. I also say that when it comes to arms control and disarmament discussions, all categories of nuclear weapons should be part of that. And also missile defense issues really need to be part of that. I think there was a beginning of a recognition on the part of nuclear weapon states, that, including the United States, that will have to be the case. I don't know where it is going today, so it's a huge concern. Integration of artificial intelligence in the nuclear command and control systems. There was, again, a beginning of discussions about that to make sure that there is a norm. First and foremost, you can start with a voluntary norm, but when it comes to nuclear weapons, command and control, humans have to be, have to retain the oversight and control. So these are already integrated into some of the discussions. It has to be really elevated to international level and acknowledge that those things actually concern everyone's security, not just nuclear weapon states. Also, so far, the bilateral arms control discussions between US and the Russian Federation, of course, a new start expiring in 2 months, less than 2 months' time. It's a real concern. I really hope that the central limits under the current arrangement will be retained and maintained. But at some point, of course, it will have to become multilateral conversations beyond the United States and Russia. And hopefully China will come into that strategic stability arms control discussions. Now, what Hassan mentioned as a frustration is quite important if we are to maintain the global order in nuclear weapons. What we are worried about at the moment is that the central pillar of all of this, the NPT, if we don't have a successful conclusion next year at the review conference, it could become hollowed out. That's the expression that I'm using. Something like NPT is not going to collapse immediately, but there is a strong degree of frustration already amongst the global south non-nuclear weapon states, non-aligned countries. They are sometimes even saying, what's in it for us? The very core of the NPT, which is the grand bargain, the 3 pillars balance, is now put to question. We always say that non-proliferation and disarmament are 2 sides of the same coin. You cannot press only on non-proliferation if you don't actually work on disarmament and then be fully committed to disarmament. So all of these, we have opportunity to make sure that we can fix it, but we need to approach these issues with a new perspectives, definitely.
Thank you, Izumi. So between all of you, what you laid out for us is a very complicated canvas. But you all did a very good job of sort of pinpointing different aspects of what that canvas looks like. Maybe what I would like to do is, for this second round of questions, just ask you for your very brief thoughts on how do we identify a pathway back to a more stable framework. So maybe, Hassan, if I could start with you, if we look at how future arms control, we have the global which prevailed during future arms control look like?
Challenging, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I would say back to basics. Rather than trying to find new flashy, snazzy concepts, technical fixes and solutions, I think what we need to do is to go back to understanding that nuclear weapons are different type of weapons than any other weapons. We should foster, encourage nuclear restraint as a defining attitude towards anything that has to do with these weapons. The consequences of a nuclear war is going to touch everyone, everywhere. It will impact regional states, global economy, will have dramatic humanitarian consequences. We cannot just treat this as normal weapons. So I would say foster an ethos of restraint and responsibility, which was really the core behind all the international architecture, order, institutions that were built throughout the nuclear age. The idea of nuclear control emerged alongside the development of nuclear weapons. The realization that these are just special, different, and need different ways of dealing with them than other weapons is really embedded into nuclear history from the get-go. And I think returning to this is very, very important. I would say also some of the boring stuff is important. Building institutions, verification mechanisms, ability to conduct inspections, investing in international institutions, and we have plenty in the nuclear field, and a lot of very good infrastructure. And the risk there is that this can fall on the wayside if does not get funded, does not get enough attention. And at the time when there is perhaps less attention to these boring nuts and bolts of the order, I think there's huge room for middle powers to play in order to support and foster these institutions.
Yeah.
So I would say fostering an ethos of responsibility and nuclear restraint, and investing into the infrastructure that we currently have for inspections and verification are two key things I would propose.
No, thank you, Hassan. Francesca, in the interim, until we could get back to the framework that Hassan outlined for us, so what do we do? Specifically, how do we reduce nuclear risks? And how do we reinforce strategic stability? So if we do have to live with nuclear weapons and more nuclear weapons for a long time, how can we live with these weapons in a way that ensures that these weapons are not used? And maybe while you have the mic, what about Golden Dome? Right? I mean, it has to be golden, right? We can't reconsider, there's no other color for it. So you can tell us, what about Golden Dome?
So first of all, let me mention an important point that your question prompted. Coming back to principles or coming back to the first generation of arms control, to me, is no longer possible. The world is very different, and the experience the United States has had with arms control is mixed. The belief is, yes, we've got some, but did arms control really bring about more predictability? No. Did it transform the nature of the international system? No. Russia cheats most of the time. So arms control today is a really dirty word in Washington. And I would stay away from claiming about arms control. But there is another point here about Golden Dome. There is now in the United States a profound doubt that reciprocity still exists in the nuclear order. And what I mean by this is the following. The United States, in some instances, no longer believe that if they were going to be restrained, that China and Russia will follow suit. That there are some choices the Chinese and Russians are making independently from the position or the policy the United States might take. And the question we need to ask strategically is, what are the systems that will trigger, right, a security dilemma and a response, and which ones the Chinese and the Russians will certainly go ahead independent from what we do. I think Golden Dome is in that sense, is the idea that, look, at the end of the day, if we are no longer believing in reciprocity, then we need to maximize what's good for us. And I think it comes with damaging consequences, but I think that's the shift here. But let me just make one point about risk reduction. I would also challenge and be very careful, I say this to my students, that we just use words a little bit too loosely, right? Risk reduction, we do transparency. I would actually stay away from many of these concepts. What do we mean by transparency? What exactly are we asking these countries to be transparent about? Because if we were asking China, how many times, you and I have had this conversation, tell us how many nuclear weapons are you building? And China would say 878. Great, what would you do with that number? Nothing. So what is the kind of transparency do we need? And the best and the only one, in my view, that you can get today is not numbers and is not intention. It's just behavior. It's by looking at the behavior of countries and detecting what the real intentions are. So the way in which we need to move, in my view, is risk reduction by numbers, cutting down on the warheads, into risk reduction by behavior. What are we seeing in the case of China in outer space? What are we seeing with underwater drones when it comes to Russia? And we need to move the conversation, in my view, from political commitments to technical management. I finish with this. Arms control is a political instrument, right? engaging with your adversaries in costly accommodations. Given the domestic situation of countries today, this is no longer possible. For me, what's the best we can do is getting technical de-escalation mechanisms. That's why we're getting back to, like, you know, pre-launch early missile notification or maritime security accidents agreement. So technical things that somehow are not purely political in nature, they'll be very difficult, in my view, to be supported domestically.
Yeah.
So that, to me, is the shift in risk reduction we need to do now.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I'm conscious of the time. So with your permission, Togzhan, Izumi, I would like to open it up to questions from the floor and maybe bring questions I had, maybe bundle those and bring them back to you to address maybe as final reflections. So if I could take a round of quick questions from the floor, if you raise your hand, and we will try and direct the mic to you. Yes, please. Quick questions, please.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have the chance. And I mean, firstly, I would like to say that I'm Wu Chensi from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. I think China's nuclear policy not changed, especially the political commitment to no first use, no use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. Here, my question is actually about Europe. I think we lost a piece here about Europe. I mean, on one side, the European side believes that it becomes a little bit irrelevant to current arms control because focusing is on US, Russia, and China. But on the other side, we see that kind of new development of nuclear, umbrella in Europe. So sure, how we think of that kind of Europe's role now in the kind of international arms control non-proliferation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, there's a question, the lady at the back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Gabriela Bernal. I'm a non-resident fellow at the European Center for North Korean Studies. And I was wondering if I could get some opinions about North Korea, being as it is a major issue that wasn't much discussed. Specifically, do you believe denuclearization is still possible of North Korea? And if not, what kind of arms control measures do you think would be most effective in controlling the North Korean threat, specifically in the long term? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe one final question here from the gentleman.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Al-Muntasir from UNIDI Geneva Institute for Disarmament Research. Just a question on non-proliferation and proliferation, maybe to Dr. Francesca. Do you see links to these trends on the key nuclear armed states with proliferation and maybe also in the Middle East, if you can just, and also I invite the other panelists to speak about that. Thank you.
All right. Let me take these questions and direct them to Izumi and Togzhan, please. Izumi, you mentioned the stress on the NPT. Clearly, this we have Ukraine. We've seen how great power competition can intrude on the review process for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you voiced your concerns about not getting a final outcome document for the next review conference. I think this question on Europe is very pertinent. We are seeing very interesting nuclear developments in Europe. We are seeing conversations about nuclear sharing. Within the context of the NATO alliance, we are seeing discussions in certain capitals about reassessing their commitment to the renunciation of nuclear weapons. How would these things figure into the review process, given everything you've said? And how can we shore up the NPT moving forward to ensure that it remains a cornerstone of the global nuclear order?
Okay, start with Europe. Indeed, we didn't really talk about Europe on this panel, but the security considerations in Europe is massively shifting or shifted. I'm very brave. I still go to Europe and talk about D word, disarmament. I mean, I'm told that even arms control is these days very, very unpopular, let alone disarmament, D word. So I think one of the fundamentals that we need to understand is that disarmament toolbox is quite wide. And you know, the common things like TCBM, that's part of a disarmament toolbox as we defined it. And therefore, it's not a utopian idealistic sentiments that we are talking about. We are bringing disarmament discussions, arms control discussions to all countries as part of a security instruments. We need to combine those various disarmament instruments together with deterrence, military expenditure, etc., etc. So dominance and deterrence only security will backfire on all of us at some point. That's the realization that we need to achieve now. Coming back to NPT, yes, the good thing about NPT is that there is no template for outcome document. So if states parties are able to have creativity, innovation, in terms of framing what is common grounds. And I see there are some conversions on some of the issues related to, for example, accountability, strengthened reporting, generally speaking, improving the review cycles. I think there is understanding, general understanding that risk reduction is necessary. I kind of a little bit differ from Francesca said, because the political statements are so much adding the temperature into this whole discussions. Risk reduction cannot be just technical. I think I agree with you. Whole range of pragmatic technical means are very important discussions related to risk reduction, but there will have to be also political understanding that they all need to lower the temperature. And so, there are some areas of conversions. If we can capture in a sort of creative manner, then we will be able to still have good enough outcome documents from the MPT. And as the Secretariat, our role is also to communicate that the outcome that they will be able to achieve will be a good starting point, and then we should be building on to send a positive message.
Thank you, Izumi. We are out of time, but maybe I could just ask the organizers to give us a couple of minutes to allow Togzhan to maybe address these regional tipping points, what was mentioned in the questions. Korea, the Middle East, so Iran and Israel, of course, South Asia, which we didn't talk about. So there are regional tipping points that are emerging that can have profound consequences. How do we shore up those guardrails so to ensure that they don't destabilize the global nuclear order?
So on the regional conflicts, I want to state that there is no such thing as just a limited regional nuclear exchange, that if anything happens, the impact will be actually devastating. There are good studies done by Lily Xie and her colleagues, and they calculated that, let's take a scenario, India, Pakistan, only 3% of the global nuclear arsenal is used. It's not only the people who will die immediately, it's also about famine that will follow in months and years, and they've calculated that up to 2 billion people will die from just an India-Pakistan exchange. So regional conflicts are extremely difficult. North Korea, Iran, and I think here I want to make a point that it's also the behavior of major powers, and that it's not conducive to progress on these fronts. With North Korea, for example, unfortunately, I think denuclearization is not possible, so it's about non-proliferation. It's about how do you prevent North Korea from advancing its nuclear and missile capabilities. Right now, North Korea shops around the international market, buys whatever it needs on the international market, dual-use goods, technology. The UN Security Council will not have any new sanctions because of the political situation. The UN panel of experts on North Korea, the mandate wasn't extended, and that's the panel that was monitoring the implementation of sanctions. It wasn't extended because Russia opposed it. On Iran, for example, it's about how we make sure Iran doesn't get to the military nuclear capability. Again, the Iran deal was shattered because the US left it. The military attacks by the US and Israel on nuclear facilities are not helpful. They are actually detrimental, and they make Iran even more determined to proceed. So it is about managing on the ground level of how you prevent North Korea and Iran from getting access to sensitive goods, but the political context is actually not making it easy. So it's very dangerous, but also we need to look at the behavior of major powers.
Thank you. And on that somber note, we will bring this discussion to a close. Thank you to all the speakers. You've given us much food for reflection and thought. Thank you all for coming to participate in this discussion. Please join me in a round of applause and thanks for our panel.